Welcome to the Health Equity and Environmental Justice 101. We know that you're busy and you may be wondering why this is a required training. CDPHE's mission is to protect and improve the health of Colorado's people and the quality of its environment. If there are certain segments of the population that are not thriving, it is our responsibility as CDPHE employees to try and work toward solutions in order to protect and improve conditions for all Coloradans. Equity and justice are key pieces to the puzzle, but they can be complex topics. As CDPHE staff, we are charged with deepening our understanding of how to address health and environmental inequities. Ultimately, we should be committed to eliminating disparities among Coloradans. For this reason, CDPHE leadership is making an investment through you, the department's valuable staff, to ensure you have a fundamental understanding of these key concepts. As you work your way through the following content, think about how individual examples could be applied to your work. This will require you to think critically and apply a concept to your job here at CDPHE. This is particularly important because the work we do is tied together, regardless of our division or title. The fact is that health is in the making long before a person seeks medical care. It starts where we live, work, learn, play, and pray. While individual responsibility is important, the choices we have available are determined by environment, social, and economic factors. And these factors are linked to social norms and systems that have left many behind. Many historic laws, policies, and practices have given fewer opportunities to certain communities for generations. Our health and well-being, both as individuals and as communities, continue to be impacted by the events, decisions, and experiences of the past. Before we can move forward with addressing today's inequities, we have to understand the root causes and how to avoid them in the future. In some cases, government policies were responsible for many historic inequities. Since inequities were caused by policies, the good news is there's something we can do about inequities through our policies, processes, and systems in Colorado state government. Equity and justice are multi-layered, and we could spend weeks discussing how to apply these concepts to our work at CDPHE. What you're watching now is a foundational course. It will help you understand what these concepts mean, but developing deeper knowledge and skills on these topics will require additional discussion, reflection, and training through your daily work at CDPHE. The intent of this course is not to change your values or beliefs. The intent is to help you set expectations about workplace culture at CDPHE, and we hope it exposes you to different ways of thinking. We encourage you to have conversations with your colleagues about questions, thoughts, and challenges that come up for you throughout the course. By the end of this course, you should be able to demonstrate an increased awareness and knowledge of the basic principles of health equity and environmental justice. Specifically, you'll be asked to define the terms diversity, inclusion, equality, and equity. Understand the role of social determinants of health in creating overall health. Summarize the meaning of environmental justice. And recognize the root causes of societal inequities, including certain historic U.S. policies. You'll be asked to reflect upon the material you've learned and think about how some of these concepts relate to your work. We hope that by the end of today's course, you'll leave with more questions than you have in this moment. That will be an indicator of success, and we encourage you to continue the conversation with colleagues both internal and external to the department. Equity is about creating systems where everyone can thrive, and we cannot do this without thinking about environmental justice, health, who we are, and where we come from. Each of us has a unique life experience based on where we were born, where we live, what language we speak, how old we are, and our gender, sexual identity, religion, race, ability, income level, and so forth. In this image before you, the lighter green areas depict these type of social identities. As these identities combine, for example, if we are a person of color with a disability, the impacts of inequity are compounded. The more areas of light green that overlap to dark green, the more barriers we face and the fewer opportunities we have to succeed and thrive. This concept of intersectionality recognizes that we each have many social identities, some of which are more often discriminated against than others. Having more of these identities means facing greater barriers. When we face more systemic barriers, the impacts of inequity are compounded, and we have fewer opportunities available to succeed and thrive. The most well-documented inequities throughout history are based on race, and so these are the ones we were able to highlight most often. However, we realize inequities exist based on many other social identities, and more data needs to be collected on inequities based on demographics such as gender, sexual identity, ability, age, and others. Did you know that your zip code is more important than your genetic code? That's because where you live is about more than your address. It's about your opportunities. Next, we'll watch a brief video from the California Endowment that goes into more detail.
What determines how long we'll live? Is it what we do? Is it who we are? Actually, when it comes to predicting how long you'll live, your zip code is more important than your genetic code. Here's how this works. Meet Deb and Maria. They both have jobs, they're around the same age, they're both married, and they both have 2 kids. Deb lives in A-Town, while Maria lives in B-ville, less than 1 mile away. They're similar in so many ways, but here's the thing. On average, residents of B-ville will die more than 15 years sooner than the residents of A-Town. Why? Because where you live is about more than just your address. It's about your opportunities. For example, Deb and Maria's access to healthy options is really different. In A-Town, Deb's family is surrounded by healthy food options, including farmers markets, specialty shops, and grocery stores. The air in A-Town is cleaner and fresher, and there are lots of safe, clean parks where Deb can exercise and her children can play. A-Town has good public schools for Deb's kids and easy access to emergency and preventive health care. On the other hand, B-ville has broken, badly lit sidewalks, and the parks are unsafe. The air is filled with truck exhausts from the nearby highway. And for food options, Maria's only choices are B-ville's many liquor stores, fast food places, or convenience stores. The schools in B-ville are overcrowded and undersupported. And even if Maria can get her kids into better schools far away, she needs to figure out how to get them there without access to a car. So for Maria, having to juggle so much to find healthy options can be an overwhelming source of chronic stress, which is a serious health risk factor. In fact, for all the residents of B-ville, chronic stress drives health problems like obesity, diabetes, asthma, and heart disease. How did A-Town and B-ville get so different? Well, in many cases in cities and towns across California, the root cause was racial and economic discrimination. Over the generations, poor white people and people of color were pushed to less desirable parts of town, where banks refused to lend money, businesses left, jobs too, schools declined, and the neighborhood crumbled. Everyone who could move away did. And what's more, when communities like A-Town and B-ville are so unequal, B-ville isn't the only one that suffers. Because it turns out that not only is your zip code a predictor of how long you'll live, so is what country you live in. Countries with the greatest income inequality have the lowest life expectancy. So even Americans like Deb, who are white, insured, college-educated, and upper income, die younger than their peers in other countries. In fact, our life expectancy is 43rd in the world, and that number is slipping. In the end, our biggest health risk may actually be inequality, and extreme inequality hurts us all. So what do we do? Well, if we're all going to be healthier, we don't just need to help the folks in B-ville beat the odds. We need to change the odds for everyone.
Did you note in the previous video that they talked about how extreme inequities hurts us all? In the United States, our life expectancy is 43rd in the world, and that number is slipping. So even those who are college educated, white, insured, and have higher incomes die earlier than their peers in other countries with less inequity. That means that equity is not a zero-sum game. Research shows that by using an equity approach to level the playing field, we are not taking away opportunities from some, but rather we are improving opportunities for all. If we all want to be healthier, live in cleaner environments, and have better economic opportunity, we need to change the odds for everyone by using an equity lens. Now that you have a broad idea of the concept of health equity, let's examine what life expectancies look like closer to home here in Colorado. This map, commissioned by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and created by the Virginia Commonwealth University, shows a part of the city of Denver. The numbers you see here represent average life expectancy. Each pin represents a different Denver neighborhood. Take a look at the top of the graphic where you'll see the neighborhood of Globeville. Residents in this neighborhood are, on average, expected to live 73 years. Now look at the bottom of the graphic where you'll see the neighborhood of Washington Park. Residents here are, on average, expected to live 84 years. These two neighborhoods are both in the same city, within relative close proximity, but have an average life expectancy difference of 11 years. To put that into context, that's over a decade of life lost. Why do you think this disparity of 11 years exists? What type of factors influence our health outcomes, even when living in the same city? Generally speaking, how do the type of people living in Globeville neighborhood different from the type of people living in the Washington Park neighborhood? Do people in each neighborhood live there by choice? These are the types of questions we'll explore next. We'll start by watching a clip from the documentary series called Unnatural Causes, which discusses how history shapes our present-day circumstances. We encourage you to watch the whole series, which is available for rent at the Office of Health Equity.
We had vast public investments in building the suburbs of America. Federally supported loans, FHA loans, went to people who were moving to the suburbs, and for many years, up until the 60s, those loans were available on a racially restricted basis. African Americans and other people of color didn't have access to them.
Until 1962, out of $120 billion in government-backed home loans, less than 2% went to non-white households. In Northern California, between the war and 1960, of 350,000 federally guaranteed new home loans, less than 100 went to black families. In cities like Richmond, African Americans were left behind in increasingly neglected neighborhoods. In the 1980s, poor Latino and Southeast Asian immigrants began joining them in these same neighborhoods.
Once the community starts to go downhill, nobody wants to actually invest in the community, so the banks don't want to come in and the shops don't want to come in. Then you don't have a commercial base, you don't have the community taxes that can then feed back into the schools. Now you don't have good schools, so families don't want to move into the community if they don't have to because you don't have good schools, and you get a sort of vicious cycle of everybody who can will leave the community.
This isn't something that happens overnight, and it isn't the fault of the people who live there. The people who live in low-income, disinvested communities did not do this to themselves.
20 years before his heart attack, Kwai tried to move his family out of Richmond, but 11 months later, they had to move back.
I can't find my job up there, and she can't find her job up there. And moved back, my older son, hang around with the wrong group and then use some kind of drug. I just don't know what to do. I try to help him. I try to straighten him out. Spend a lot of money, owe people a lot of money. That's what in my mind all the time. So it's worry, just worry. When I'm going to pay up all of this, and how I'm going to do it.
Hani cái disparity cho hàng năm lớn mới trở lại.
If you think about when you're worried, you're always a little bit more activated. There's a little bit more vigilance. You're sort of checking things out a little bit more carefully. And if you can imagine that happening day after day, all day, every day, it's exhausting. And it wears on the body system.
When stress is chronic, when we're endlessly worried about our bills, our job, our children's safety, the body pumps out cortisol and adrenaline. But too much of these stress hormones over time can increase arterial plaque, raise blood pressure, and weaken our immune system, increasing our risk for almost every chronic disease, including heart disease, the leading killer in America.
We've done studies that have shown that living in disadvantaged neighborhoods is related to an increased risk. It's about 50 to 80% increase in risk of developing heart disease. And this has been replicated in other studies.
The Unnatural Causes video we just watched mentioned the practice of redlining, which was a policy by the Federal Housing Administration put into place during the 1930s. What you see in front of you is a historic redlining map of the city of Denver, as well as an image of language from a historic redlining manual. Redlining manuals created by the Federal Housing Administration instructed surveyors to draw red lines around neighborhoods to mark them as undesirable or risky places for home builders to build new homes because of, quote, hazardous infiltration, unquote, of people of color or foreign-born populations. This means the red lines were determined based on the number of families of color living in a given neighborhood. Property values were determined by race. Because redline neighborhoods were marked as hazardous by the Federal Housing Administration, families living in those areas could not get home loans from banks. And when developers wanted to build new homes or businesses, the Federal Housing Administration would only give them money to build far away from these neighborhoods in what became the suburbs. These areas are denoted by green or blue. Denver was the only Colorado city large enough at the time to have an official map published, but it's important to note that the same criteria and practices of redlining were used in rural parts of the United States as well. This includes the practice of racial covenants. Although redlining was eventually made illegal by the 1964 Fair Housing Act, families of color still feel the impacts of redlining today. Because redlining denied home loans to families of color, they were unable to build wealth through home ownership. In the United States, one of the fastest ways to build generational wealth and financial stability is to own a home. We also start to see the effect across generations because children whose parents and grandparents lived in redline neighborhoods are more likely to grow up in these same neighborhoods today. As you can imagine, this impacts many social determinants of health, including environmental conditions, neighborhood infrastructure, having a safe and stable place to call home, and a financial safety net from one generation to the next. CDPHE data shows that the effects of redlining still persist today. Here you see present-day maps of Denver in red, orange, green, and blue compared to the historic redline areas of Denver. The diagonal darker areas of the present-day map shows higher rates of poverty, concentration of communities of color, poor mental health, and diabetes. Do you notice any trends with the current-day maps on this slide as compared to the map of redlining? Do you notice how certain Denver neighborhoods consistently have darker shades across all four maps? Many of these neighborhoods were historically redlined. Across all the maps, you should see the same diagonal pattern from the top right toward the bottom left of the Denver map. So far, we've talked about root causes of inequities. We're now ready to start exploring what equity is. Here you have a graphic commissioned by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. While the terms equality and equity may sound very similar, they are distinct. The top image displays what the term equality means. In simple words, equality is about treating everyone the same, regardless of context or starting place. Equality is not a bad thing, and in some circumstances, we must first strive for equality before we can get to equity. Equity is displayed at the bottom of the graphic. Equity is about treating people or communities differently so they have the opportunity to succeed. Equity acknowledges we all have different histories, starting places, and present-day context, and that the starting line, so to speak, is different for everyone. When learning about equity for the first time, it's easy to interpret that equity is a zero-sum game, meaning that it requires taking something from one person and giving it to someone else. But this oversimplifies equity. Oftentimes, when an equity lens is used, we are leveling the playing field and benefiting multiple groups at the same time. An example of this is curb cuts, the sloped edges on sidewalks. Curb cuts were originally intended to benefit people in wheelchairs, but they benefit many others, such as people with strollers, delivery carts, bicyclists, and travelers with luggage. Equality and equity are both part of a larger spectrum that include diversity and inclusion. This slide shows that spectrum and demonstrates how we need aspects of all of these in our daily work. We've talked a bit already about equality and equity, so let's focus on diversity and inclusion. When we use the term diversity, it is simply a description of differences in a group or organization. Diversity is not always strategic. It can happen accidentally. It's important to note that diversity does not describe how people function or work. It is possible to be diverse and not include people or communities. Inclusion is what you do with your diversity. It goes beyond simply becoming a diverse group by truly leveraging abilities, unique qualities, and perspectives of individuals. It's similar to equality and equity. As a reminder, equality is about treating everyone the same, but doesn't necessarily consider each individual's context. Equity is about leveling the playing field and treating groups or individuals differently so everyone has the opportunity to succeed. The double-headed arrow at the top demonstrates the fact that all of these components are important to a workplace. It's not that one is better than the other. But in order to use an equity lens, we must ensure that we have diversity, inclusion, and equality. Many different definitions of equity exist, which is to be expected because it's a complex topic. The Colorado Office of Health Equity, or OHE, which is housed at CDPHE, uses the definition of equity that you see here. Although concise, OHE aimed to define what equity is in the first sentence while giving an idea of how to advance equity in the second sentence. As previously discussed, we know that the root causes of inequities are tied to many different systems, policies, and community factors such as housing, transportation, education, race, and income. For this reason, OHE mentions various systems in the second sentence. This is also why the first sentence doesn't begin with the term health equity. OHE believes it's critical to lead our work with the concept of equity in general, and we should then naturally see improvements in health and well-being. Feel free to use this definition however it makes sense in your work at the department. Bear in mind that no definition is perfect, and language is ever evolving, so we also encourage you to use this definition to spark additional dialogue. In order to implement equity into our daily work, it's also important to distinguish the difference between disparity and inequity. When we use the term disparities, we're referring simply to differences in health status or outcomes across different populations. For example, a higher prevalence of cancer among older adults compared to children. When we use the term inequity, we're still referring to differences, but the differences are systemic, avoidable, unfair, and unjust. What does this mean? It means that there's a root cause, our story, behind the difference that was not natural, but rather was created by social conditions. For example, research demonstrates that when Black or African American women are diagnosed with breast cancer, they have a higher mortality rate as compared to white women. This is true even when the women have the same income and education. The only difference is race. This tells us it is not a natural difference. There is something deeper going on that we need to explore, something systemic, avoidable, unfair, and unjust. This also means inequities are the cause of disparities. Therefore, When we address inequities or the root causes, we reduce disparities. Whereas if we begin by looking at the disparities, we might miss the root causes or the entire story and unintentionally cause more disparities. We know that all of these definitions and concepts can seem broad and theoretical. So how do they apply to our communities? How do we begin to take action to achieve equity? When people think about illness, disease, or mortality, they tend to think about the doctor's office in healthcare. However, research shows that clinical care is only a small piece of the puzzle, about 20%. Here you see a pie chart demonstrating what researchers have found to predict health. Aside from clinical care, other factors that are critical include our health behaviors, such as the foods we eat and the amount of exercise we get. But notice that the greatest predictor is social and economic factors, which includes factors like income and race. Not only is this the greatest factor on its own, but it also heavily influences our health behaviors and physical environment. For example, if a person lives in a neighborhood without access to a grocery store, the opportunity to choose healthier options is limited. Similarly, it may be difficult to engage in physical activity if it's unsafe or unpleasant to walk, run, or bicycle in one's own neighborhood. Physical environments refer to conditions such as the air quality outside or whether one has environmental toxins inside the home, such as lead or mold, and is also heavily influenced by social and economic factors. The reality is that upwards of 80% of our health can be predicted by social, economic, and environmental factors. The framework you see on this slide was created by the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities Initiative, also known as BARHI, and it is an important model for thinking about inequities in our communities. This graphic describes what we call the determinants of health. Let's start by looking at the right side of the BARHI framework, or the downstream determinants of health. The downstream determinants of health are what we think of as current public health practice. It describes our access to care, disease, and injury. These downstream determinants are heavily influenced by the left side of the graphic, the upstream determinants of health. The upstream determinants of health, also known as social determinants of health, are factors outside of clinical care and behaviors that impact our health outcomes, including our race, sexual orientation, how we are treated by institutions, and our living environment. Generally, we think about the social determinants of health as being these factors on the left half of the framework. They are the circumstances in which people are born, grow, live, work, play, and age. They are the social and economic factors outside of traditional health that shape our opportunities for health. Let's take a closer look at our living conditions. This category describes not just our physical environment, but also our income, employment, and education. Our employment and income determines what neighborhoods we can live in, and where we live determines whether we have easy access to health care, grocery stores with nutritious food, and schools with good education. It also impacts our health behaviors. If we live in neighborhoods without sidewalks or access to green spaces, then we can't choose to take a walk around our neighborhood or play outside. So where we live and the resources we have in our communities have a significant impact on the downstream determinants of access to care, disease, and mortality. Now moving further upstream to the left, we see that our living conditions are influenced by institutional and social inequities. Institutional inequities describe how corporations, government agencies, schools, laws, and regulations provide opportunities based on social identities. Each of us has a unique life experience based on where we were born, where we live, what language we speak, how old we are, our gender, sexual identity, and so forth. These life experiences are what shape our social identities. Some social identities face greater systemic barriers than others. This is what we call social inequities. When we have more social identities that are more often discriminated against, we face greater barriers to living conditions and access to care, and have fewer opportunities to thrive. As a state agency staff, we work at an institution, so it's important for us to think critically about how our institutions treat individuals, families, and communities. This includes how we authentically and respectfully engage communities more impacted by inequities to understand their experiences interacting with institutions. This framework grounds our understanding of how our health outcomes are determined by social and institutional inequities. Next, we are going to hear more on this topic from Dr. Kamara Jones, who is a leader in the field of health equity and has a compelling way of talking about the impact of social inequities. She was formerly the president of the American Public Health Association and has worked as an epidemiologist, family physician, teacher, and leader in public health. In this video, Dr. Jones will focus on social inequities and how they have a powerful impact on the opportunities that we have available to us. Specifically, she will use a story to explain the influence of social inequities on institutions, policies, and individuals, which shapes where we live, work, learn, and play for many generations. As you're listening to Dr. Jones, think of the Barhai framework displayed on the slide. How do the descriptions and allegories Dr. Jones is describing align with the framework? How does your story or the story of your family connect with what Dr. Jones is describing? After the video, we'll have some time to reflect.
My third story, Levels of Racism, A Gardener's Tale, comes from my experience when my husband and I, newlywed, bought our first freestanding house with a big wraparound porch with flower boxes all along the porch. Now, when we went to plant our marigold seeds, we saw some of the boxes had dirt in them and some of the boxes were empty. So my husband dutifully goes to the gardening store and he's hauling big old bags of potting soil, and we fill up the empty boxes and we put equal numbers of seeds in all of the boxes. And we water all of the boxes. And I'm not the gardener, so I sit back just going to enjoy. And 3 weeks later, I walk out of my front door and I stopped in my tracks, because it looked to me like we had planted completely different species in some of the boxes versus others. In some of the boxes, they were full of plants, tall and vigorous looking plants, and other boxes just had a few plants in them and they were scrawny and scraggly. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil was rich, fertile soil, so that in the potting soil, every single seed had sprouted, with the strong seed growing very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed making it to a middling height. But in that old soil, that poor rocky soil that we had found there, the weak seed had died. And even the strong seed had to struggle to make it halfway up. And if you guys garden, well, maybe you've composted half of your garden and you've seen the same thing. This image is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. And I'm going to make it a story about racism. But before I do that, I want to talk to you just a little bit more about racism, because in the story I'm going to illustrate 3 different levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. And so, you know, sometimes I have an hour to talk about these things. I don't today, but I'm just going to quickly define each of them, make some important points, and then share the story. Institutionalized racism, what is it? It is that system that results in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that's been institutionalized in our laws and our norms and actually often shows up as inherited disadvantage. These are some examples of how it can impact you. Sometimes people look at my top bullet of housing, education, employment, and wealth, and they ask, isn't that social class? Why do you have this on a slide about racism? To which I respond, it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That's not just a happenstance. But for each marginalized, oppressed, stigmatized group, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for American Indians, for example, it was the taking of the land and the genocide, and then the moving of the survivors to the reservations. For people of African descent, it was the kidnapping of West African people, and then our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people stop me there and they say, well, you know what, Dr. Jones, you're talking about slavery. But the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and that's fully 149 years ago now. So all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But the key phrase there is all else being equal. and all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today. And there are still what I describe as contemporary, present-day structural factors that are perpetuating the initial historical insult. And so when people ask me, am I talking about racism or social class, I say that institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. Before I get off of this, I need to also say that institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, and often shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So here now we're talking about what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the prejudice and the discrimination, lots of ways that it can impact your health and your whole well-being. And like institutionalized racism, it can be through acts of doing as well as acts of not doing, but even more important, it can be unintentional as well as intentional. You don't have to intend it to have a racist impact, to do something racist to have a racist impact. Third level of racism, internalized racism, I define as acceptance by members of the stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. Lots of ways that it can affect us, and it's really about accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed.
Now that we understand the three forms of racism, let's listen to Dr. Jones tell us a story about how these three forms of racism, or social inequities, impact the opportunities we have available to us.
So now, with this background about what I describe as these three levels of racism, let's go back to the story. So here I have now 2 flower boxes. But what we're going to introduce is a gardener. A gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the flowers are going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the flowers are going to produce red blossoms. And this gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, and she takes the pink seed and she throws it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she sees in her garden what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the seed is sprouted. The strong seed has grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak red seed has made it to a middling height. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And here comes the strong pink seed, just trying to make it halfway up. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And then year after year after year after year, the same thing happens until finally, 10 years later, the gardener is looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story there for a minute to say that this first part of the story tells us something about institutionalized racism, where you had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But okay, well, let's pick the story back up. Where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, now the gardener is looking at red, thinking that red is mighty beautiful. She looks over the pink flowers and she says, oh, they sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she sees that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil and she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that still goes on. And where is internalized racism in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee, bzzz, and then up to another pink flower, bzzz, and then it comes toward this other pink flower, and that pink flower says, get away from me, bee, do not bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in the garden? Well, let's start with addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink, right? And that's an important intervention. That's an important intervention. But as you can see, Even if you do that, that's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. Or maybe you say, okay, let's deal with the personally mediated racism. So let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So we have our workshop, and in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't, right? But even if she does, it still won't change the situation in which they find themselves. I think that if we really want to set things right in the garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if we want to keep separate boxes too, that's all right too, but if we do, it means that we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious as the red. And in that intervention, we might also address the internalized racism. Pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, we also might address the personally mediated. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful will be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So, in this story, I've actually illustrated these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, and very strongly suggested that if we want to set things right, we have to address the institutionalized racism. Good if we address all the levels at the same time. But the most important question is one that I haven't raised yet, and that is, who is the gardener, right? Because the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. Well, who is the gardener? The gardener clearly includes government, as well as media, as well as foundations and corporations, and even communities to the extent that they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink, right? And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, because she's not even really keeping the pink flowers as part of her garden. And our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Lots of different questions that can come out of this story.
The last video discussed the powerful impact of racism and other social inequities in causing different health outcomes. Thinking back to the Barhai framework, which is on the screen right now, we'll now focus on institutional inequities and living conditions. Specifically, the following video details how institutional laws and policies influence our living conditions.
Okay, so this is a city. Here are all the people living in it, people of all different colors, ages, wealths, and incomes. Except they don't all live together in the same place. They're separated into different parts of the city by what color they are, what language they speak, and how much money they have. And those different parts of the city look quite different. The parts that are whiter and wealthier tend to have green spaces, grocery stores with nutritious organic food, and of course the money to buy it, and are often far away from pollution-emitting freeways. The parts that are poorer and more diverse tend to have industrial sites, heavy-duty diesel-polluted ports and highways, and hazardous waste, all things that the city relies on to run properly, but that heavily pollute the air and water. And even if they had those grocery stores with nutritious organic food, most residents there couldn't afford it anyway. How did this happen? Well, this segregation can be traced back to race-based zoning and housing policies, but it wasn't always as deliberate as plain old racism. Some separations can simply be traced to poor land use planning. And, as a result, these residents of the same city live very different lives. Say the city realizes it has an emissions problem. It comes up with a plan to reduce air pollution, plant more trees to suck up the carbon, or start a cap-and-trade program. But those trees get planted in the neighborhoods that are already green, and the factories that are spewing toxins into the air just buy more carbon offsets and keep spewing their toxins. The benefits of these programs are enjoyed by the communities that are already doing just fine, and the communities that were hurting most from all that air pollution, well, they're still hurting. This isn't just an imaginary city, this is the story of real cities all across the US where people might live in the very same area code, but their race, ethnicity, or wealth and income bracket causes them to experience wildly different quality of air, water, and life. In fact, it can even mean that they also experience different deaths. That's how serious this stuff is. This kind of inequity expands far beyond cities, too. Rural areas are full of commercially valuable resources like oil and coal, and they're also home to indigenous and low-income communities. But when those resources are extracted, those communities don't see any of the money, and they end up with all the air and water contamination that's left over from the extraction. And we even see this injustice on a global level, like in small island nations that are forced to directly confront the consequences of rising sea levels, but haven't played any significant role in the industries that are causing climate change. These peoples are sometimes forced to flee their homes because their land is literally going underwater. But the very states that did play a hand in creating climate change don't have migration policies to accommodate them. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're talking about how we can try to break down and reimagine a system that's built up on these inequities. A system where those who are already disadvantaged because of their race and economic status are made poorer because they're unable to profit from the resources that the world depends on and are made sick or worse by the environmental contamination that comes with extracting those resources. Social inequities are intimately tied to the environment. That's why social justice is an environmental issue too.
The previous video introduced the concept of environmental justice, which is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which they live, learn, and work. Thinking about and witnessing how the different types of discrimination can impact the health of our communities can be powerful and upsetting. It's important you know that across the country, most of your colleagues in public and environmental health are thinking about, experiencing, and working on these issues also. We know it can be tough, but we also know it's important work if we really want to help make changes in our communities so community members can live as healthy a life as possible. Equity and justice impacts all of us in different ways on a daily basis. Not just in our work, but in our personal lives as well. Next, you will hear from one of your colleagues at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment about his experience with equity and justice. As you are listening to his story, think about how this connects to the Barhai framework and the Dr. Kamara Jones Gardner's allegory. Specifically, how does his story highlight the impact of social and institutional inequities?
Hi, my name's Al Stafford. I'm an employee here at the CDPHE with the Water Quality Control Division. I went to grad school up at CSU, and that's when I moved out here to Colorado from Connecticut originally. I've got a wife and 3 kids, and have been working here at the division for about 8 years now. One thing that's a little different about me that you might not notice from the outside necessarily is that I identify as transgender. So I transitioned from female to male, and have been undergoing my transition for about 8 years now, 9 years almost. Basically what I did was I started taking hormones about 8 or 9 years ago. So I take testosterone, and I had started that about a year before I began here as a temp. Started my temp work, and in between being a temp and having a full-time position here, I had top surgery on my chest. I also was able to change my name through the division. So my old name, I had my old name as a temp and was able to transition to my current name once I became a full-time employee. Recently, in the last few years, I had to have a hysterectomy due to a number of health issues that I was having. I was in quite a bit of pain, and so it was time to undertake that step of my transition. Unfortunately, the insurance company did not cover my hysterectomy because by the time the paperwork all got sent through, even though they had pre-approved it, once they saw that it was a male having a hysterectomy, they said that they cannot cover that because males do not require hysterectomies. Therefore, the bills started to pile up, We tried to fight it, my wife and I. Spoke with the insurance company, spoke with the medical professionals and the doctors who would perform the surgery, and no one was able to help us, unfortunately, to get that surgery covered. And so it did affect my credit score, and over time I did end up having to pay that bill. Obviously, this also really brought on quite a bit of stress and humiliation. Each phone call trying to deal with the issue was really quite humiliating, having to talk about my transition and just sort of fight for myself as to why I needed surgery. So even though I'm very privileged and have a very strong partner and a great advocate, still ended up really having struggles due to my transition and the medical care required around it. So this is really a great example of these institutional inequities. In healthcare and insurance, we really do see an institutional inequity that's biased against trans people and the LGBT community as a whole. Trans people tend to not go to the doctor as often. They get discriminated at the doctor, both under financial issues as well as just getting the care that they need. And then obviously, the work environment gets affected over time because I wasn't able to connect with my coworkers in a way that perhaps other folks can when they were having a surgery that they're more comfortable discussing. And so really overall there are these institutional inequities against the trans population where we see that trans people are underemployed or unemployed at a higher number, and then also really deal with these institutional inequities in the healthcare sector as well.
Al Stafford showed just a bit of his experience identifying as a transgender individual. Looking back at the Barhive framework on this slide, think about how this type of experience might impact a person's living conditions. For example, the type of employment they're able to maintain and how this might impact a person's income. Now look at the institutional inequities box. What role do businesses, laws, and government agencies have in determining a transgender person's living conditions? Finally, take a look at the social inequities box and think about what ism might contribute to those institutional inequities. Equity is not just a consideration for the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Many of our partners outside of public health and across state agencies are thinking about using an equity lens in their work as well. This is important because no single department or agency can solve these complex social issues on its own. It requires partnerships to work on systems and policy level solutions. Next, you will hear from a partner at the Colorado Department of Transportation and how they are thinking about health and environment impacts in their transportation plan.
My name is Aaron Willis. I'm with the Colorado Department of Transportation. I'm a transportation planner there. And my main responsibility is public involvement in regards to this statewide transportation plan. Normally our transportation plans set the vision for transportation for the entire state. And so that includes developing goals and strategies, looking at needs, looking at gaps, and really with an emphasis on priorities. We know that transportation can hinder folks from accessing parks and recreational opportunities in the state, from healthy foods, from health care. We know that we perhaps have not included that in the planning process because we normally think about those type of access issues far later downstream when it comes closer to project development. The collaboration that we have with CDPHE is going to be extremely important in helping us to fold in public health and equity into the statewide transportation plan.
You just heard a partner speak about how the Colorado Department of Transportation is incorporating health and equity considerations into the statewide transportation plan, which will have an impact on how all Coloradans access transportation. This relationship is mutually beneficial because CDPHE is also integrating transportation considerations into the statewide health plan. In addition, divisions across CDPHE are thinking about how their work aligns with partners outside of health and environment, such as education, housing, and the justice system. Think about your work. What partners might you leverage or build outside of CDPHE? The intention of this course is to bring awareness to health equity and environmental justice and how they can be applied to the work that you do as a state agency employee. We know we presented a lot of information today, but you should know that you are not alone in the journey to understand inequities and to make a difference through our environmental and public health role. You may not have realized that you're already practicing equity in certain ways. Recognizing there is no blueprint for doing this work, we want to encourage you to explore innovative ideas. As we come to the end of this course, take a moment to read this quote from William Ward. You may be asking yourself, what can I do to decrease these inequities, or at least prevent the gaps from widening? There are no simple answers or silver bullets, and oftentimes using an equity lens in our work is more about asking the right questions rather than having all the answers. There are tools and resources listed on this slide to help you do just that. Congratulations! You have successfully arrived at the end of this course. Remember, this is just a first step. You are encouraged to discuss these concepts with members of your team, other coworkers, and CDPHE leadership in an effort to continue learning about health equity and environmental justice and to keep the conversation going. There are also more training sessions you can attend at CDPHE, such as the Health Equity and Environmental Justice 201, as well as an Introduction to Inclusion and Advanced Inclusion.